Welcome to the Insights solo episodes of the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. My name is Marie Gervais. If you're passionate about gleaning leadership gems from others and delight at the capacity of the human spirit to survive and thrive, this is the show for you. After interviewing 100 plus guests from diverse cultures and professions, I have learned a thing or two about what makes successful people tick and effective managers lead. In each episode, I elaborate on one or several of the themes sparked by Culture and Leadership Connections guests and reflect on how these motifs can help us all be better humans. Join me as we contribute to the leadership discourse by elevating thought around the cultures and leadership themes that influence management and work. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections listeners. This is episode 8 of Culture and Leadership Insights solo podcasts. And today I would like to discuss with you understandings for improved intercultural communication at work. When we are working with people who are from the same culture as we are, we unconsciously understand the rules of engagement. We know what's polite and what's rude. We can quickly identify topics that are not usually discussed in public. We know how much emotion we should show to be considered normal. And if we break any of the rules, we know what the consequences are for doing it. All of these understandings are completely different when we're communicating across cultures, because what is a norm in one country, region, city, or town is something people just know, and they grew into it without being able to explain it. And so when we run across cultural differences, we don't really know what's going on because we don't necessarily see it as being culture. It feels like a distortion. It's like looking in a fun room set of distortion mirrors where what you think you see is not what you really see. Or it's like stepping into quicksand when you thought you were on solid ground. Or it's like dancing with a dance partner who's doing a different dance from the one that you're trying to do. It just feels awkward and strange. And comfort increases with exposure to cultural difference, to relationship building, to having discussions and personal reflection on things. And development grows intercultural understandings. So when that happens, people feel that they're in a more predictable and less distressing environment. But initially, when you first confront a new cultural context, you feel distressed. And that's very common. So in a multicultural workforce, people don't usually understand what's the difference between cultural, personal, performance, or wellness related. And it's only through increased exposure to one or more cultures that they start to be able to make that differentiation. And that's important because otherwise everything feels like a personal insult. And if everything feels like a personal insult, it also becomes a threat to identity. So in the worst case scenario, when we feel that our identity is threatened, we usually want to exclude, marginalize, or make others feel uncomfortable until they leave. And that makes people who are leaving feel discouraged. They're afraid, and their loneliness and sense of rejection increases. So the problem with a threat to cultural difference is just that whole thing about people feeling excluded and marginalized and others feeling justified in excluding and marginalizing them. So in the best case scenario, existing employees understand that it's going to take some time and some effort to get to know the new people. And it'll take a little bit of effort to harmonize everybody's expectations, but it's really worth the effort because that mix of differences and common interests is going to build nuanced understandings that could never have occurred in a homogenous group. And so this becomes really valued for members on both sides. And after a while, people think that they just do not want to work in a homogenous environment because they're feeling that it's so much better and so much more insightful and more comprehensive and just more satisfying to be in a multicultural environment. But if these cultural differences are not understood, people don't reach that feeling of comfort and understanding. And that's why I wanted to talk to you about this today. So I'm going to start by just explaining a couple of the grand lines of culture so that we can have a common understanding for how to understand culture at work. And I think what's really important is this idea of cultural identity. We can have two different responses to cultural difference, and that response tells us something about our own attachment to cultural identity. If I feel threatened by difference, then my identity is anchored to external behaviors and expected norms. And I fear losing my identity if I associate with people in groups that are not like mine. This can happen on both sides. So it can happen to somebody who is already in the existing culture or can happen on the side of someone who's coming into a different culture. Either way, they can feel that they are losing their identity if they associate with the other people. And that loss of identity also means you feel like you're losing your values and your integrity. It's very distressing. But if your identity is connected to being a human being first, and then everything else is second, then it becomes possible to add on new repertoire without this feeling of loss. So, I already know this. I wonder how these people do things differently. And what could I learn about that? Will I adopt it? Will I make a slight change or big change, or will I not? I have to just consider it because it's a new repertoire. It's a new information. It's not threatening to my identity because I'm not attached to it. And I'm not attached to something in my identity either. I'm just thinking, I wonder what's going on here and what could I learn from it? So that sense of cultural identity is really critical to being able to work across difference. If your identity is linked to belief that culture is static and unchangeable, then you will reject anything that gets too close to your cultural beliefs. So you could have a misunderstanding between generations, gender, race, religion, culture, language, ethnicity, just to mention a few, and they can be seen as serious threats to my very being. They might be proof of evidence that we can never overcome conflicts and will always have to be in a combative relationship with difference because our very identity survival is at stake. And you can certainly see this playing out in the world conflicts that are happening in the world now and have been for a long time. This idea that my identity is under threat and at stake unless I reduce the threat of the other identity. But if my identity is rooted in the idea that culture is always changing and adapting and that I can learn new things as I grow, then my identity is not such a fragile thing that I have to protect at all costs. Learning about others becomes interesting, conflicts become solvable, and misunderstandings are taken lightly. They're not taken so seriously because my identity becomes the sum of the many parts and experiences that I have, and I have some choice in it. I don't lose belonging to my original cultural group by associating with people who are different, and I do not become assimilated into another cultural group. Instead, I experience, learn, and make some changes that feel right for me at that time, always preserving my original identity. So my original identity is there, but it's seen as being flexible and resilient, and it's not subject to loss. So that's a big difference in approach to cultural identity. And in some ways, it can be related to the idea of a fixed mindset and a growth mindset, which is something that emerged in the 70s and has become part of the way people think about growth in the workplace. So let me just explain a little bit about that. A fixed mindset sees things as already established and unchangeable. It sees life as a series of destiny-related events over which we do not have control. A growth mindset sees life as full of options and possibilities, and it looks for ways to take advantage of the opportunities and mitigate the risks. Let me give you some examples. With a fixed mindset, I'm not talented as an artist, and I can't do math, and I know I will never go to college because no one in my family ever has, and I can't earn more money than my father. These are all statements of a fixed mindset. But a growth mindset would say, I can learn some art techniques to improve my abilities. Or math with the right tools, books, teachers, and encouragement is something that I could probably get pretty good at. You might say, I can go to college once I know the steps and requirements and meet some people who can mentor me. And you could also say, I can earn money related to my education, skills, experience, and my ability to pitch my value to my employer. Those are all statements of a growth mindset. So you can see that a growth mindset doesn't think that there's only one way to do things and it's destiny. A growth mindset sees that there are options and possibilities and that there is some level of choice. A fixed mindset sees everything as being already established from the beginning, and there's no chance to change it or to control it because it's already been established. So you can see how those two different mindsets will affect how people see culture and the way they see their job and their ability to learn at work. So if we question our cultural beliefs and traditions or values, a fixed mindset will see that as being disloyal, and it is something that is impossible. It's like a fish becoming a bird because you won't belong to that group anymore. If you start questioning what it means to swim, then you won't belong to the fish group anymore and you're not going to be able to fly. So you're just going to be excluded and have nothing. That's how the fixed mindset works. But the growth mindset sees questioning cultural beliefs, traditions, and values as part of life and a way that we can increase our repertoire and deepen our understandings. It is likely to make us feel more loyal to our group and more proud of our group, but also to accept that some things may not always be correct and that we don't have to agree with them all the time just because we are a member of that group. So the growth mindset gives you a few more options. The fixed mindset gives you very few options. And understanding people's statements as being fixed or growth oriented can really help you to understand where they're coming from. So I think these are quite useful considerations about culture generally. But now I'd like to just focus on one consideration in the workplace that comes up quite regularly. Now, at work, there are cultural expectations around management behaviors, employee behaviors, their expectations around hierarchy and promotion, indirect and direct communication, and feedback that feels either appropriately corrective or encouraging or personally hurtful, and participation that feels natural and appropriate to the context or unnatural and inappropriate to the context. So all of those are workplace cultural understandings, but I'm just going to talk about one today, and that is the one about direct and indirect communication. In other podcast episodes, I'll talk about some of the other categories, but this one affects work really significantly. So I thought I would speak to that one first. So let's say I am a manager and I have a question. And so I ask one of the other people that I'm working with, how many employees will be affected by the change of schedule? So that's a direct question. And I may be expecting a direct response. A direct response would sound like this. It looks like 15% of our employees in 2 departments will be affected by this change of schedule. It doesn't involve any emotion. It's just a statement of possible looking at the data and possible fact. It's not fact yet because it hasn't been affirmed, but there's no threat to identity or threat to relationship or threat to emotion in this statement, in either the direct question or the direct response. So if both people are working from a direct mindset and a direct communication tendency, they will understand each other and they will just move forward with that. But where we run into problems is if one person is direct and the other person is indirect. So let's say you have this question. You need to find out how many employees are going to be affected by a change of schedule. The indirect response might be, our employees experience change in all aspects of their work. So if you're direct, you're going to go, what? What kind of an answer is that? I want to know how many employees. I don't want to know that everybody experiences change. I want to know if the schedule change is going to affect people and who is it going to affect the most. And it will be frustrating to the direct questioner and also to the indirect answerer, because the indirect answerer is going to feel like they're being backed against the wall and they're being forced into something that could cause them to lose face if they're wrong. And if they lose face, then the relationship would be at stake. So it's got a really big relationship and emotional context that's being assumed. So the direct respondent, if you're a direct respondent and you've got an indirect questioner, you're going to feel that there's avoidance. You're going to think that people are hiding something or that they are incompetent and they've made a mistake, but they just are trying to cover it up. So that's a typical response of a direct approach. But the indirect approach is going to look at it as in, how can we make sure that we maintain the integrity of the relationship, harmonize our expectations, and find a way to answer questions without causing anyone to have to make a mistake for which they might feel they'd lost face. So here's what you might ask if you're working with an indirect person. You might say, if I wanted to know how many employees will be affected by the schedule change, what would I need to do first? Or if I wanted to know how many employees will be affected by the change of schedule, who would you suggest I speak to? So you see, you're allowing the indirect respondent to answer without being right or wrong. They're just pointing you in another direction that could still get you the answer that you're looking for. Now, if you're indirect and you're working with a direct person, you might change your question to be, I need to know how many employees will be affected by the change of schedule, and I need to know what approach would work best. So that helps the direct person to feel that information and time will be valued. A direct communication style values getting the answer and getting it fast. The indirect communication style values maintaining the relationship and avoiding causing loss of face. So you can see they have different goals. And so if you phrase the question a little bit differently, you can get the same answer that you need, but it's just going to not cause damage to the person's communication style. It's just taking one step towards the other person. So both approaches will work to get an answer. In the indirect approach, the speaker is conscious of the relationship integrity that needs to be preserved. And in the direct approach, the speaker realizes the other person needs to know an answer and doesn't see context or relationships as being part of this. So I hope that makes some sense. And that you can think about this when you're asking questions or answering questions. Think about, is this person tending towards direct or indirect questions or responses? And when you are able to perceive that, then you can change the way you're asking a question or answering a question in a way that's a little closer to their style without changing yourself. You're just changing something that helps them to understand and get the answer or give the answer. So let me just do a little recap. I was talking today about cultural communication in the workplace. Culture is a component of personality, and it can affect workplace understandings and relationships. Each culture has its own rules and expectations, and both existing staff and newcomers need to learn rules and expectations that can be harmonized between the groups so that they can function effectively at work. To avoid merging everything into one category and feeling insulted and having your identity threatened, consider that a behavior could be cultural, personal, performance, or wellness related, or it could be some combination. And these distinctions will become more apparent to you over time as you have increased exposure to a variety of people from one or several cultures. The personal sense of threat from cultural difference can occur when identity is rooted in the known culture and fixed, or rooted in the known culture with a possibility of adding new repertoire without losing the self. Cultural flexibility is also affected by a fixed or growth mindset. In the fixed mindset, it's dangerous to question in-group beliefs, traditions, and values, whereas in the growth mindset, questioning is part of understanding and helps to deepen your loyalty to the group and to encourage openness to the outgroup. One workplace communication category that I discussed with you today is the difference between direct and indirect cultural tendencies and how people respond if they're in either side, and how you can change your questioning slightly or your response slightly in order to help the other person understand you, depending on whatever their cultural orientation to direct and indirect communication is. So in conclusion, although understanding cultural identity, mindsets, and tendencies is not going to eliminate workplace misunderstandings, it can help to reduce perceptions of threat. And in a non-threatening context, individuals from both cultures feel more comfortable taking a step towards the other, which increases our capacity to solve issues more effectively and focus on the work tasks at hand. That concludes episode 8, Understandings for Improved Intercultural Communication at Work. And if you liked this episode and found it useful, I would love to hear from you. You know, you can always go to our fan list on the podcast webpage, shiftworkplace.com. Go to podcast and look at our fan list. And you can write a question or a comment, and you can even contribute a tip. Either way, it would be most welcome. So thank you so much for listening. Share this episode with a friend, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Newsflash! Listeners can now interact with Culture and Leadership Connections podcast by leaving a voice or text message on Fan List. It is a fun and quick way to let me know what you liked, ask a question, or leave a suggestion. I will feature some of the voice messages on upcoming episodes. You might be surprised to hear your own voice, but only if you leave a message, of course. So to leave your personal message or your question, go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and click on the fan list link to leave it. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say.